Hello, in just a moment, the press preview as we take a look at the morning newspapers. First, though, of course, our top stories. The Supreme Court has ruled that the government must consult MPs before starting the process of leaving the European Union. Ministers say they will bring a bill within days. Research seen exclusively by Sky News suggests people who eat seafood are absorbing tiny pieces of plastic into their bloodstream with unknown effects on their health. And nearly £8 million was wiped off the stock market value of BT today after it revealed the true cost of an accounting scandal in its Italian business. Well, hello there, you're watching Sky News and the press preview. In the next half hour, we'll be seeing what's making the headlines with the editor of the Times Literary Supplement, Stig Abell, and the journalist and filmmaker, Jenny Kleeman. Welcome to both of you. So, to the front pages then, one story dominating, the Metro, leading with that Supreme Court decision that MPs must be given a vote on the logistics of Brexit. The Times calls today's decision a blow to ministers. The Eye quotes lead claimant Gina Miller as saying politicians have behaved despicably. The Financial Times reports that it will force Theresa May to table emergency legislation in order to keep her timetable for Brexit on track. The decision, that is, not the FT. The Express focuses on Brexit Secretary David Davis's plea to MPs not to stand in the way of any such bill. The Daily Mail claims pro-EU MPs will force the Prime Minister to lay out her plans in provisional white paper form before they get written into a bill, or else they will vote against her. There can be no turning back, says the Telegraph's top story, as it highlights the way in which Mrs May's political opponents might try to stop her. The Guardian reports that rebel Tory MPs are demanding more of a role in determining whether the UK will remain a part of the European single market. Meanwhile, the Daily Mirror highlights what it calls the national epidemic of drivers using mobile phones while at the wheel. The Star has a story concerning the death of Michael Jackson, as told by his daughter. And The Sun reports on a court case involving an unnamed TV star. So, Stig Abell and Jenny Kleeman are here. You wanted to go to the Times first. Judges making history in a Brexit blow to ministers, some suggesting it could have been worse if they'd suggested that the devolved governments would have more of a say.
Yes, this was a good thing, I think, for the country, because this is how we do things. We test things properly, we put things through the courts, we have an independent judiciary and...
People are throwing buns at the telly right now.
Yes.
I think.
No, it is a good it's a good thing for, you know, no matter where you stand on the Brexit debate, it is important that if we leave the European Union, that we do it properly and that we do it legally. And clearly,
with a resounding mandate from Parliament, as some say.
Yes, and the 2015 Referendum Act was badly worded, did not set out what the legal path would be to go down if we were to leave the European Union. Because of this, we need to have...
It would have run to dozens of pages if it did that, to be fair.
It does, but no, there was a very...
Is that good enough reason not to do it?
That's why
who would
we're in
have read it
this
as a voter
situation.
and sat there and read the whole thing?
Well, I think if you're going to try and set up what is, as we're now seeing to the nth degree, a tremendously complicated series on a spectrum of options, if you try and pretend that that actually is as straightforward as a binary one, you could have at least suggested that there may be various ways of skinning that particular cat.
A member of the opposition could have made the point that this was setting us up for a kind of legal quagmire in the future. The fact is, this court case, this entire thing was brought by a private individual, not by any opposition MP or leader or anybody saying we need clarity, the government...
Like those ones there, you
Parliament should make a say, yes. And what's interesting about the whole court case is that when it was first brought, I mean, Gina Miller today has been saying, this is not about politics, this is about doing what's right according to the rule of law. But I think, you know, obviously, I voted to remain, but it was very clear that when the court case was brought initially, it was a way of maybe finding a way of avoiding triggering Article 50, giving MPs a get-out, but there doesn't seem to be an appetite for this. You have now, of course, Jeremy Corbyn having to deal with the threat of UKIP, Paul Nuttall having explicitly said that UKIP is targeting Labour seats. He cannot be seen to be anything but pro-Brexit, so there's not really going to be much opposition from the Labour Party. The Lib Dems will oppose it, but they don't have very many MPs. The SNP are going to table as many amendments as possible, but it doesn't look like Brexit is going to be stopped in any way at all because of this.
This isn't a bad day for Brexiteers and people watching this, and you can almost see it in the coverage that when the first court case happened, everyone was deliberately sort of frothing themselves up into a lather of indignation about how this is the enemies of the people and standing in the way of Brexit. And you can kind of see a half-hearted attempt to continue that. But of course it isn't, because Theresa May had, before this decision, said we're going to have a vote in Parliament. We know that...
Yeah, but not at this point. At the end of the process, that's what she's promised so far.
Yeah, but
it's not the same thing at all.
But she gave an No, I think it is the same thing. She effectively
But this is about triggering Article 50, that Parliament gives a mandate to the executive to trigger Article 50. And she has promised one at the end of the process after the negotiations.
She has opened up the notion of parliamentary involvement. All of the parties, the major parties, or both Labour and the Tories, have indicated very clearly they're going to get behind Brexit. Parliamentarians fall over themselves to say we're not going to stand in the way of Article 50. So in lots of ways, this is not really taking us any further, except for the fact that now the extent to which Parliament can get involved in the detail is slightly up for grabs. So you talk about the SNP giving amendments, you talk about the extent to which the government could be compelled to give a white paper, setting out its thinking. It will try and give the shortest possible thing ever. It will literally say, we want Brexit, we're triggering Article 50, full stop. Then the various different levels of thinking will get involved. The best suggestion, I mentioned this before, but it's so good when you think about it. Chuck Ramuna, I think, suggested this, an amendment he could put at the bottom of this bill that says, we will support this if the government undertakes, as promised, to give £350 million a week to the NHS. And you can imagine the number of parties. The SNP would get behind that because it's mischief. Labour would get behind it because it's the party of the NHS. Remaining Tories would get behind it. And Brexiteers can hardly say otherwise because they promised the goddamn thing on the side of a bus. So that sort of thing, I suppose, could happen. What government doesn't want to do is to get this endlessly enmeshed in detail, because they don't really have an idea of the detail themselves.
So you're not quite buying into the Daily Mail MP's new plot to thwart Brexit. You're saying simply there aren't enough of them who will thwart it. Theresa May, of course, has a famously small
majority, but not as small as the number of Lib Dems, for example, there are. And so the people actually who want to thwart Brexit, who will overtly say that, well, some Lib Dems, there's 8, 9 of them, some SNP people, there's 30 of them, and there's the kind of people like Ken Clarke and people like that who'll say
and some Labour MPs.
But not enough.
Not enough for it to be a serious issue. There is not going to be a parliamentary plot to thwart Brexit.
And correctly so. I mean, as I said, the will of the people thing gets overblown and it becomes a horrible cliche. Well, but there was a referendum. The referendum was set on the terms it was set, and
it's a question of the legitimacy of Parliament. What's the point of consulting the people if you're then going to disregard what they say?
So if we go inside the Daily Mail, this is a double-page spread of which we do not have page 7, but you're guessing it says champions of the people.
Champions of the people.
This is the paper that said enemies of the people.
The Daily Mail named and shamed the judges involved in the previous decision, calling them enemies of the people for scrutinising the law, and they got a lot of stick for it. And so today they're kind of cheekily sort of harking back to that without victimising the judges by calling the 3 judges who were in the government's favour as champions of the people. It is explicitly these judges' duty to not be political, to be impartial. This is what makes Britain the envy of the rest of the world, is our reputation for fairness and for justice. And actually, there's been lots of suggestions today that we should look into the background and the political leanings of judges, like as happens in the US, which I think is
just a sort of Carswell thing.
Yes, which is just shameful because there is nothing to suggest that these judges have acted in any way other than looking at the rule of law. They have explained. I mean, Neuberger in his address explained how they came to this decision, and I don't think we should necessarily be following America when it comes to, I think
that's right. And they've avoided. I mean, I think this shows that the Mail has possibly learnt from what happened when it did enemies of the people, because people got very het up about that with some legitimacy. However, they also overreacted, I think, slightly to it. The Mail is famously often a bit silly when it talks about judges as gay fencers or whatever. It is something that will genuinely lead to laughter and mockery. And what they've done at least with that is to say, we're not calling them enemies of the people, we're supporting the ones who've stood up for the side of the argument we believe in, which is probably as close as you're going to get to the Mail admitting their first effort had gone too far.
And the interesting thing is that Liz Truss today put out a statement saying how much the government believes in and supports the independence of the judiciary. At the same time, as the verdict was read out, in order to head off these kinds of criticisms. And in the past, Liz Truss had been criticised for not coming out robustly enough in
I'm struck by
support of the
how
judges.
actually low-fevered all of this now is. I mean, when the initial
Is
court
that because
case...
we've had Theresa May's speech, but also we've had Donald Trump and,
Puts everything
the
in
madness
context.
that is? Or
That's
whatever.
possibly... I think Theresa May has deliberately, last week, set a feeling of momentum that even if you were voted Remain, you at least recognise this is going to happen.
Yeah.
And we might as well at least move towards something happening, because something is better than nothing. And I think that sense of momentum, the sense of this decision effectively not being that far different to what the government were going to do anyway, which is to have some degree of parliamentary scrutiny. The fact that it closes off the idea of the devolved powers having any say at all. So the spectre of an immediate Scottish independence problem has slightly pushed back further. It just feels like there's a certain lowering of tension
It's
in
also
the
the case that for a lot of people who voted Remain, and even some people who voted Leave, the result was really shocking, and it took a long time to get their head around it. And a lot of people who voted Remain were trying to think about, oh, surely this can't be true. How can we make it so that it's not true? And I think now people are resigned to the fact that this is going to happen, and now we have to look at the terms of which it is going to happen. So you know, attempts like this to change
And just
things.
a final thought on this woman, Gina Miller, who,
Yes.
as it said there in The Guardian, the result, she said, compensated for abuse she'd suffered from pro-Brexit trolls, and yet the Daily Mail is now beginning to question her law degree
Which is
and do
totally
a classic
irrelevant.
Daily Mail on her, in other words.
Well, her law degree is irrelevant because she has not presented herself as a lawyer. The Daily Mail likes picking people apart, and particularly when it comes to women. And I have to say that a lot of the very pro-Brexit people can be really, really vicious on social media. I have felt it myself. And good on her for sticking her head above the parapet and weathering all of that and bringing this to its conclusion.
I do totally agree with that. However, I am struck by the fact that it's not just pro-Brexit people being horrible on social media. People of all stripes, of all political persuasions, are often vile to their fellow human beings. And it's very striking to me that Gina Miller suffered it. There is a panoply of people suffering it the whole time. And actually, we all probably need to look at the ugliness that kind of bubbles underneath everything now, because it's not just people who are...
It's Donald Trump's fault.
No, Donald Trump says he's suffing it too.
Well,
poor Donald.
Well, I'll tell you who is
Poor
suffering it,
Donald.
Barron Trump.
Yes,
A 10-year-old
yes.
innocent kid,
Yeah.
you get a bunch of people purportedly liberal mocking him, and that's what you see everywhere, and it's kind of infected humanity. It's really depressing.
But the good news is,
Oh,
we're
good,
going
there's
to
some
talk
good
about a
news.
story next, which is why we get less moody with age. Back
Yeah,
to that
so
in
I've just
a
disproved
moment.
that slightly.
Yes, I know. Back in a moment. Well, welcome back. With me this evening, Stig Abel, editor of the Times Literary Supplement, and the documentary maker and journalist Jenny Kleeman. Welcome to you. Back to the Times, a front page. GPs draw up plans for patient charging.
It's difficult, this, because this is, as ever, the constant battle between an NHS that's completely overwhelmed with an ageing population and how do we get treatment from GPs, because the more that GPs can do, the less pressure there'll be on services like A&E, which will be better for the NHS. And so the question is, and the plan here suggested by some GPs is to have a slight element of elective treatment for which you pay. And of course that will cause a great deal of concern for people who fear
Which bit then?
the creeping privatisation.
Yeah.
It's things that they talk about, non-cancerous mole removal of vasectomies, or
Sort
things
of being seen at the weekends.
Right.
or out of hours. And what's fascinating politically is every political party in England is committed to privatisation of the NHS, no matter what they say. Because if you look at it, the Tories have introduced it most recently in the coalition agreement and the Health and Social Care Bill to have a provision of services provided by the private sector. Labour, under Tony Blair, massively increased the internal marketplace of the NHS. UKIP is outwardly committed to privatising lots of sections of the NHS. So when people talk about the fear of privatising the NHS, that fear is over. Not only is it happening, every single political party in this country, because the Lib Dems agreed with the Tories when they were in coalition, so every single political party in England has their hands involved in the privatisation of the NHS. It is not something that is a last trench to be defended.
Do you really
It is
think Labour under Jeremy Corbyn would allow any sort of privatisation?
It's too late. It's already happened. The NHS, as constituted by the Blair government, they spent a lot of money on it, so they invested
Are you
in
talking
it.
about the PFI initiatives?
Well,
and
there's
things like
there's
that?
PFI, there's the internal marketplace. was a great Labour idea, and it started with John Major, but it came into the Labour Party as well. The internal marketplace, finding competition for various services. You know, it started with cleaners. There's lots of parts of the NHS which are open to private areas, and this is just be another example. And it probably is so. The momentum is such, it is impossible to resist it.
The easiest way of doing it is charging people if they miss an appointment, for example. That's the sort of the lowest level of antagonism for people who are trying to keep the NHS fully state-funded, isn't it? Is that likely to come in? Are we ever likely to see the Rubicon crossed in that sense?
Well, I think the current way that the NHS is being funded isn't working, and we have seen this. That doesn't mean to say that the NHS should be privatised or that you should ever have to pay at the point of delivery, but there needs to be massive investment. There needs to also be massive reorganisation, because a lot of the problems with the NHS are managerial. There is a lot of waste because it is a large and unwieldy institution. I think things like this with GPs' practices, I think a lot of people would be prepared to pay. You shouldn't have a two-tier system where there's convenience for those who can afford it.
We must pack on, got lots to pack in. Mobile phone at the wheel, Mirror.
They've been campaigning on this for a long time. You've chosen to blur the faces out here, but
We have.
The Mirror haven't. They're naming and shaming people. I mean, gosh, you could do this anywhere on any journey, and so I guess it probably isn't fair to single these people out. But yeah, it is potentially very, very dangerous and should be as taboo as drink driving, because it's got the same detrimental effect on your ability
And you could
to drive.
you could sentence people to prison for doing it in the same. You don't wait till a drunk driver crashes the car before you convict them. You convict them for the threat of being drunk in charge of a car. You could convict someone for playing on their mobile in the same way.
Not send them to overcrowded prisons for that.
No, I'm not saying go to prison, but you could convict them as a criminal offence, I'd have thought.
Oscars?
Yes, La La Land's the one to watch. 14
So why are they
nominations.
saying rah-rah? Oh,
Rah-rah.
rah-rah. Right, okay, I get it.
The thing that's interesting-
Thing is, if you have to ask, it's not worked, Anna.
Two things interesting about this is that you've got 7 nominations in the acting categories for non-white actors, as opposed to the last 2 years where they were all white, which is probably a good thing. It's definitely a good thing. But I really love Dev Patel, and I want him to win, because there's an awkwardness about him, and I would just love to see him holding an Oscar.
You are not an Academy member and don't get a vote. And your final story, Victor Meldrew, won't believe it, we get less grumpy with age. Is that because we retire?
No, it's not even. It's not even actually that old. It's just as you progress through life, you get a little bit more relaxed. You get a little bit more self-confident. You get a little bit more willing to see the complexities in the world.
It says the anatomy of your brain changes. This has a physical basis, apparently, although...
And then the volunteers were aged 22 to 36, so that's about us. And I think you get a bit less judgmental, don't you, as you're older? You get a bit more
Well,
relaxed.
we're talking about this
I
with
agree
respect
with this.
to Donald Trump. Does this mean, what was he like in his 20s, if this is true?
Yeah.
I think this. I'm buying this actually.
Are you?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, good
because
luck
you're
with
old.
that.
Yeah, you're old, Anna. What do you think?
I think that's a load of rubbish. Well,
Typical old person, always grumbling.
on that note, it's time to say thank you very much indeed. Thank you for coming in. We
Good
will see you
night.
soon.